it's good to be here, thanks.
You were talking about reflection yesterday.
Yeah.
Jamie Keddy was just talking about reflection as well. And I wondered whether you had anything to say about what Jamie had been saying.
Yeah, it was just interesting. He was talking about the analogy with music and the notion of practice as being a stepping stone to learning, which I agree with. You know, I think there's a lot to be said for intensive language practice. I need it myself, but not at the expense of big picture looks at language. So my view there is that we needed to counterbalance the drilling age by having more holistic views of language and more communicative views of language. So I think, you know, nothing against drilling, but it's a stepping stone. It's not the end of the road. And a lot of teachers don't go beyond drilling in their classrooms, you know, believing they've done the job if they have intensive practice. And what happens is that the free stage of a lesson gets squeezed out. So, you know, I think that's really important. And I don't think student-centered in itself is, you know, you can't go completely student-centered. I think a much more useful term in a language classroom is learning-centered. So anything that a teacher does with students which promotes learning is absolutely fine. And if that's sometimes teacher-centered and sometimes student-centered, it's absolutely fine. A much more useful criterion is learning-centered.
And what ways do you think, in what ways can we promote reflection in learners in a more learning-centered way?
Well, I think that learning has to become a much more conscious process for learners in classrooms. Very often, the methodology that a teacher employs in the classroom is not subject to scrutiny or to discussion by learners. It's simply what the teacher brings to the classroom, and learners live with it, and they, you know, they live with it or they sink in it. And I think teachers owe it to their learners to discuss what they're doing in the classroom. And I would say once a learner becomes articulate enough to react, and I think this happens at a younger age than many believe, then a teacher needs to take the preferences of learners into account. That's what I mean by learning-centered.
I mean, these ideas were articulated 30 years ago. I mean, I remember in Mike Breen and Chris Canlin's Essentials of a Communicative Curriculum. And why do you think it is that in many ways those kinds of ideas haven't been taken up in mainstream EFL?
I think partly because they emanate from universities. You know, one of the problems that we've faced all the way along the line is that a lot of innovative ideas have been generated in think tanks at universities, and they're not immediately available to teachers at the chalk face. And that streaming of ideas through from people with time to think and time to research and time to get their heads into things like this through to the classroom, there is no pathway that guarantees that those ideas are going to be run with by teachers at the classroom level. Similarly, I don't think there's enough back-channeling of information from classrooms into university departments where the research is going on, you know. So I would see all of that necessarily as a two-way process. And if we don't have a two-way process, we don't get innovation. You know, because if researchers don't listen to teachers, they don't get anywhere. But and you know, they don't have a divine right to be heard by teachers either.
And we were talking at the beginning about reflection in learners. What kind of reflection in teachers do you think we should be encouraging?
I think what's really important is for teachers to be given the opportunity somehow within the institutional framework in which they operate to have time to reflect, because most teachers lead a very busy existence. On a day-to-day basis, most teachers are stressed because of the speed at which they have to move from one class to another, from one task to another, very often accompanied by out-of-class paperwork and so on. And a teacher's life seems to be so full of all of that that they don't have time to sit back from it and reflect. And one of the things that would be really good in school management terms, if it's a learning institution, if the school is a real learning institution, a learning community, it would suggest to me that the management of that school ought to be creating space for teachers to reflect in. And what I mean by that, for example, would be giving them 1 hour a week for peer observation. or giving them the opportunity to meet once a fortnight or once every 3 weeks to nut things out between them in the in a safe environment where they could share ideas, share problems, and so on. And not enough attention is given to that because of the materialistic product orientation of education at the moment.
And finally, why do you think, I mean, these are kind of ideas that we've been talking about for decades now, and yet at ministry levels, somehow these things don't percolate through. I mean, why is this?
Sadly, I think it's to do with economics. You know, I think very often, as you'll be aware, ministry priorities are all to do with performance indicators of one sort or another. They're all to do with stuff that you can quantify and count, like success in examinations and things like this. And teacher development and the reflection that underpins teacher development is not quantifiable. It's a qualitative dimension in education. Ministries are, on the whole, insistent that quality needs to be measured, and the instruments they use to measure quality are usually examinations and blunt instruments. So not enough attention is given, if you like, to the humanistic side, the affective side of what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a learner. And as a result of that, ministries don't get involved in all of it. You know, what makes ministries tick is success indicators, and it's results, results, results. And that's right across the world at the moment, and it's a sad reflection on education.
Good. Thanks very much, Ryan.
It's a pleasure.